Welcome to this Farm Woodland Forum session. Ben, if I can now hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Harriet. I'm hoping you can see my screen okay. So yeah, as Harriet said, I'm the head of horticulture and agroforestry at the Soil Association. I also project manage an agroforestry planting at Helen Browning's 1,500-acre farm in Wiltshire. So a lot of what I'm talking about tonight will be sort of from my experience at Eastbrook. But I do have the privilege through my job of visiting lots of other amazing farmers and growers. So I have sort of picked up one or two hints from them, so I can share that as well. My background is commercial vegetable growing before I joined the Soil Association. And then I have also written a few books, one of which Harriet mentioned at the beginning, the Wood Chip Handbook. And I'm currently working on a horticultural agroforestry book with Andy Dibben. So hopefully that'll be out next year. So, see if I can get those slides to move forward. There we go. So I thought it was worth just giving you a little bit about Eastbrook Farm, just to sort of set up for sort of where my own sort of personal experience and some of this stuff has come from. So it's near Swindon. It's, as I said, it's about 1,500 acres. It's a sort of weird long farm. It's about 5 miles, 8 kilometres long. And it sort of goes right up from sort of chalky downland right down to the heavy clay, which is where we focus the initial bit of the agroforestry planting. Most of it is rented. It's Church of England farm, but again, the 200 acres at the bottom where we're focusing are owned by Helen. So that's sort of given us the opportunity to be a bit more flexible than on some of the rented land, which is still a little bit tricky. It is organically certified, so that obviously has an impact in terms of what we could do in terms of weed control. And it has a whole range of enterprises, sort of up on the downs is sort of more arable, and the pigs down where we are is mostly the dairy suckler herds. We're a bit far away from the milking parlours to run the milkers down, so there have been sheep there in the past. And we're doing a little bit of farm wilder experiments with direct drilling of cereal crops. There's also some sort of glamping down there, and Helen and her partner Tim sort of run a various pub and wholesale businesses along the side of the main farm enterprises. And Helen's motivations, as you know, I suspect many people's are around climate resilience, business resilience, building soil health and soil resilience, I would say. Animal welfare is a big one for Helen. And then, of course, biodiversity. And I suspect, like everyone on this call, you know, we all love trees, and Helen just likes being around trees and having more trees on the farm. So multiple objectives. A little example there of my almond trees from 3 or 4 years ago, interplanted with raspberries. And I can talk a little bit more about sort of setup and design in the questions maybe, but it's not the sort of main focus for tonight. So I'd like to start with ground preparation. So I'm sort of assuming that by this stage, you know, you've decided really what you're going to plant and where you're going to plant it. And there's various options. I mean, I've got 2 pictures there. There are more. There's a difference, I think, between whether you're starting with a bare field. So I was chatting to someone today who has got a field coming out of maize. And going into agroforestry, so it's, you know, very much a blank canvas. He could sow any ley that he wanted, or, you know, start again with whatever he wanted to do. We mostly at Eastbrook were planting into an existing grass clover ley. We did debate whether to do what's happening on the right there, which is to cultivate a strip and potentially sow a less vigorous cover crop into it, and again, because of the nature of the ground, it's heavy, it's wet, it's hard to find a cultivation window in the spring. We decided it was more cost and trouble than we wanted to go through. So what we did, as you can see on the left, is we created a slit in the ground. So that is a subsoiler with a sort of roller on the back, and that creates a planting slit through the ground, which makes planting much quicker, probably 3 or 4 times quicker, much easier. In theory, sort of breaks up the ground a little bit, so roots can establish, the tree root, the tap root can get down quickly. The downside of it, particularly on our soil, is when dries, which in this picture was 2017-18. So in 2018 we had that very hot dry summer, and the crack just went like that, and opened up down to about 1 metre, and we had the little sort of bare root sapling sitting on the top, clinging onto it for dear life. So it has its downsides. You can overcome that to some extent with mulching, and if you're able to irrigate with irrigation, but it's definitely a consideration if you're on clay soils. It's potentially a downside. I've heard one option which we have tried a little bit is to plant sort of 6 inches to the side of the slot, so you still put the slot in, but the tree isn't right in the middle of the slot, and that potentially can help a bit. The advantage of doing the one on the right is you've got a clean bed, and if you've gone through potentially and ploughed it or sort of deeply cultivated, you can break up the soil. It's nice and easy to plant into, and you can sow potentially a less competitive grass mix that then means that won't compete so much with the trees, and you won't need to manage it so much. So there's sort of various options. I think I'm sure Peter will sort of talk a little bit more about sort of more woodland situations, and I mean we have used that slip planter for some of our woodland creation as well. But effectively, it will depend partly on your soil, partly on the machinery that you've got to work with, and then there's as with a lot of these things, there's a cost versus benefit sort of calculation to be made about how much time and effort you want to spend preparing ground versus how much you want to spend managing it once you've planted. So then we come on to the planting bit. And you read tree planting books and you get this sort of lovely picture with a nice big hole, and you had compost, and there were some of the trees. So we did have some bare rooted apricots, for instance, that we did something along those lines, not quite such a big hole as that. But again, if you're planting lots of trees, that gets very expensive very quickly, just in terms of labour and time. So you can mechanize it a bit. So, augers are one way that you can really speed up planting. They're not necessarily suitable for all soils. So again, on clay soils, there's a risk of smearing the hole. You end up sort of with this smeared clay around the sides of the hole, which the roots potentially struggle to break out of. But certainly on that soil there, that looks pretty ideal, and if you've got a lot of trees to plant, it can be a good way of doing it. For most bare root stuff, this is how we've done it. So literally spade in the ground, slot, open it up, push it in, and stamp it back down. Again, the risk with clay soils is that slit opens up again a little bit, so mulching is quite important. But yeah, certainly most of the bare root stuff we'll plant like that final one, and they mostly do fine, as long as you don't plant them too late. Which takes us on to weed control. So the quickest, almost certainly you will need to try and control some weeds. Weed competition for trees is a big problem in establishment. And the cheapest, quickest way of doing that is to spray glyphosate around the base. However, what that doesn't do is it doesn't give you any moisture control, and it doesn't obviously build the soil or help the soil at all. In fact, slightly the opposite. There's some really good work done by David Granatstein in the States, looking at the different weed control methods for orchard trees, and he compared not just the cost of doing the weed control method, but also the performance of the trees afterwards. So he looked at things like spraying, organic and wood chip mulches, flame weeding, plastic mulches, and although the spraying was by far and away the cheapest, the trees tended not to do as well, and certainly the ones that had the wood chip mulch and the organic mulches outperformed in terms of yield, to the point where you got that money back from the extra investment in mulching, because they're building soil health, they're holding moisture in, they're doing all of those things that effectively just killing the grass won't. Mulch mats is another option. I have mostly moved away from these. I don't like them. I think they're fiddly. They blow away. They disintegrate. The voles love making a house underneath them. And if you then mulch with wood chip on top of that, then you've got an insulated home for the voles. So we've moved away from mulch mats. Probably in some situations they're still better than nothing. You know, particularly if you're not able to spray. But I'm not a huge fan generally. And then you've also got the option of mechanical weed control, and I would say this is sort of particularly relevant for maybe sort of intensive horticultural situations where you might be cultivating anyway, or you've got very productive fruit trees that you want to keep really, you know, you might want to irrigate them. Again, I'm kind of, it feels a bit destructive to me. You know, you're damaging the soil, you're releasing carbon. You need to do it a few times a year, so it's not, and you know, plus the kit is, you know, costs money. So I would, you know, in some situations I might do that if I had quite a lot of commercial fruiting trees, but I probably think for most agroforestry systems it's not necessarily the best option. And for me, really, mulching is what we try to do with all of our trees. It is expensive, even if, like us, you can get the chip for free at the moment. So we've got 2 tree surgeons who are giving us free wood chip effectively, but there's still quite a cost to moving it, you know, putting it into a trailer, taking it out to site and mulching. But we see the benefit in terms of survival rates and early tree establishment. So in this instance, this was one of our browsing blocks that we planted. So here you can see we've basically individually mulched each tree. And I'm now doing about, if I can, I'm now trying to get 25 centimeters depth of mulch onto the tree. So we've, in theory, if you look at the literature, 10 to 15 centimeters deep is the minimum you need to sort of have a significant impact. What we found doing it at that depth is that after a year or so, you needed to come back and do it again because it disintegrated too quickly. So we're now looking at trying to do one really deep mulch when we plant them and then not having to go back. That's our plan. It doesn't always work, but that's our plan. Where you've got just one straight row, you can mechanize it. So this is how we did our sort of big rows in our field with a side feeder wagon, silage feeder wagon. Worked really well as long as the chip was even. So the stuff that we chipped ourselves and we knew where it come from and we knew it was all of one size, it was fine. The stuff we're getting in from tree surgeons is just a bit too much risk of sort of bigger stuff, or, you know, we've even had the odd chainsaw helmet or pruning saw that's come in with it. And not surprisingly, the farm manager wasn't very keen to have that going through his machinery. This, you can see it worked really well there. We did then have a couple of rows where the fence got put up before we managed to mulch it. So we had to sort of adapt it with a little sort of side shoot and extending it up over the side, which also worked okay. We experimented with going down both sides. So sort of going up one side and then down the other. We ended up putting really like loads of mulch on because it was hard to control it and drive fast enough. So in the end, what we did was just drive down one side and then just go up with a rake and just rake it back around the trees. So it took a little bit of time, but it was still, I think, the most efficient way of doing it. The problem you can see here, though, in a way, so although it was really quick, so these rows are about 400 meters long. And, you know, it took, I don't know, I can't remember how long it took, about 4 hours to do the whole row. You know, so that included loading up so it took sort of 3 or 4 loads and then you have to drive. So it was, you know, it still took time, but it was pretty quick. But, you know, the problem is you've got a tree there. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you've got a tree there and a tree there. And of course, you're mulching everything. So you're using a lot of mulch in between the trees, which doesn't really need it. So it's quite an expensive use of mulch in that sense. But then you save the money, you know, in terms of the time of getting it down. So if quantity is no issue, then it's great. But if you're short of material, then this is potentially a bit of a wasteful way of doing it. And this is sort of the power, in a way, of these mulches. So this picture here, these were trees planted in 2017-18, and the ones behind had about a 2.5 foot mulch of wood chip, willow wood chip, that came from the other side, planted on the same day as this tree here in front of me. So the one in front of me is now about the same. This was taken last week. So the one in front of me is now about the same height as me. And the one behind me, we reckon, is around 20 foot at least tall. So that's what having that really thick mulch did in that really hot, dry year, with a species like willow that is obviously quite water sensitive. So we've had other trees where the effect wasn't quite so big, but yeah, really interesting to see that. And the difference seems to get even bigger every year. And it comes back, I've talked about this before, but we're sort of slowing down, or trying to slow down our planting so that we can treat everything like that. If we could get everything to grow that quickly and that well, we would have much more impact. In this field, we lost 50% of the trees that year because of we planted too many, we couldn't mulch them properly, and it was really hot and dry. So we've had to then go back, we've had to replant them. There's a cost to that. If we'd planted 20% of those and mulched them really well, and then the next year 20%, and the next year 20%, we would have bigger trees over the whole site than we have now. So I think it's a real consideration when you're planting is how are you going to mulch them? What's your strategy? Do you have the resources? If you're going to get 3 months with no rain, are they going to survive? So that brings us on to protecting them. And when I'm saying pest protection, I'm talking mainly about the big stuff, so deers and rabbits and hares and things. And again, it's a cost versus benefit calculation. You could deer fence the entire farm, but for most of us, that's not financially viable. We have deer fenced 2 of our fields of planting, one where we've got sort of a lot of the expensive fruit trees. So we've got 8 acres, and it's got something like 750 quite expensive fruit trees in, and we decided that we couldn't risk losing them and having to replant them, so we deer fenced that. And the other one was one where we got a grant that included a grant for fencing, so we did that. With the others, we've gone for a sort of less cheaper effect, basically. So these so this is the same field where I showed that mulching. We've got single strand electric wire with permanent fence posts. So again, we had debates about temporary versus permanent fencing, and we said, it's so much cheaper just to put some temporary fencing, and the farm manager said, yeah, but if we do that, we'll never move it, and so we won't properly rotationally graze where we want to. Whereas now we've got a bungee cord at the end of each of these rows, and they can just move stock. It's a 2-minute job to move the stock from one paddock to the next. You can see there's quite a big gap here, and this was quite early on. It's now much more thistly than this. So it's wood chip does not control perennial weeds, and this is 1.5 meters from the tree to the fence, which is too wide, we think. So we're likely to go down to 1 meter or possibly 1.25 meters in future rows. And the reason, I can't remember if it's on this slide. No, I'll come back to it. But the reason is you want the cows to graze under it right up to the tree guard. And actually, I did notice, I think Fred Farrelly's joined as a guest, who's doing some really great stuff in Ireland, looking at fencing much closer. So if we get a chance to listen to Fred Harriet at the end of this, it'd be really worth bringing him in to talk about how he's done it. So yeah, you want them to reach under to graze up to the bottom of the tree, but not reach over and graze the tree, browse the tree. That's that's the balance. And I think we erred on the caution of not going near the tree, and we lost out. And also, if you think these rows are 400 meters long, so 1.5 meters times 400 is quite a lot of land that we've effectively sort of taken out of production temporarily. This is the temporary equivalent. This is at Farm Ed. So again, you know, I think they've come slightly narrower than us, but similar idea, but with a temporary fencing. And they can, because they've got arable cropping at parts of the rotation, they can just sort of move it all and take it. They don't move their stock quite so frequently, so it makes more sense to use that system. I mean, we're all trying to move away from plastic. So, you know, these you can see I've done with plastic. You've got the deer guards and then you've got the little spiral rabbit guards. You know, we do have quite a lot of hair in this big field and they will easily reach up over that. So, you know, we've definitely had a bit of damage on some of the willow and the alder that are planted. But again, you know, they're relatively low value trees. We want to coppice them anyway. So we're sort of monitoring that, and I think enough are surviving. In future, I think we'd plant a lot more trees in between and just hope that more survived. This is this nice green picture is one of the sort of new generation of biodegradable tree guards. This one is Next Gen, who we're going to have a demonstration at the agroforestry show for those of you who are coming with I think at least 3 of the new biodegradable options being shown. So they're, you know, they should be sturdy enough to cope for a number of years and give better protection than some of these spiral guards, but you know, they're more expensive, so that needs to be factored in. But if you factor in the cost of, you know, collecting the plastic and taking it away and recycling it, they probably aren't more expensive, and we all should be doing that. And then you've got things like, you know, this is the cactus guard, which is more expensive again, but is, you know, is reusable. You can, you know, you can do any number of plantings with it. I don't know how long the longest is likely to last, but, you know, it should last tens of years. And, you know, where you're doing individual trees in browsing situations, they seem to do a pretty good job. So lots of options, and you know, this hasn't covered all of them. Obviously, I'm sure there's others. I know, Harry, you did experiments down at Dartington, didn't you, with sort of wooden things and all the rest of it. So, you know, there's an infinite way of doing it, but it's you know, certainly for us, the electric fencing works pretty well. The deer fencing obviously works well, and actually just where we didn't graze stock initially, having you know, just the deer guards works fine as well. The stock brings that extra pressure where they, you know, where they're rubbing effectively, and that's the challenge. So that brings us on to the understory. I've talked about it a little bit in terms of that establishment about, you know, how you're going to control the grass under it. This is a picture of a vegetable situation. This is Fred Bonestrew at near Tetbury. He's got grass, quite a wide grass strip under his trees. He mows the strip. I think he says he'd rather have a less vigorous grass. I think they were put in before he took over managing them. But it's quite hard to change it once you've got it, and particularly vigorous ones. You know, if you've got a less vigorous grass, there's quite a risk that vigorous species will come in. But if you've got a very vigorous grass, nothing much is going to come in. And so mowing is sort of your only option, or potentially, I guess, grazing. So, you know, he then, because he's cropping the vegetable beds, he's controlling the, you know, the ingress into that, into the beds every time he crops. So that's one way of doing it. This is the same field that we looked at before, but before the electric fencing went in. You know, so in this field, we're controlling effectively, you know, we were silaging the main field. And then potentially what we did one year before the fences went in was actually go up close with a mower and go right up. So if you haven't got stock and you're not fenced, you can mow in between, and you can get mowers with, you know, with the reciprocal bit where they sort of bounce off the tree and mow in between. So you can control all of it if you want to, or, you know, little sort of two-wheel tractor type things which are quite flexible. You can get flails and things. So there's various options for controlling it if you've got grass. You could do the you know, the weed badger type thing where you're actually mechanically weeding the soil all the time, but then you've got bare soil and there's a risk there. or or you go for something that's very unvigorous, like a low-growing wildflower mix, or or grass, which will still need some cutting, but much less. You might get away with just doing it once a year. So there will be a cost. You can potentially just leave it and sort of hope that it doesn't get out of hand until the trees overcome it and overshadow it. I think it's a bit risky, especially in arable and cropping situations where you're likely to get sort of weed seed creeping out into the rows. And for some trees, particularly a lot of the prunus species or anything that suckers, the risk is that you end up with with suckers from the trees that then fill out, so they need controlling. So there's all of that stuff to think about, and a lot of it will depend, I think, on scale and on machinery. And we did strim a couple of the rows and then realized that with 400-meter long rows that was just going to take too long. So we've abandoned that, and effectively we're now letting it being taken over by the creeping thistle, which is it's not a major issue for us in the graze situation. We can control it within the row, within the paddocks, and then sort of let it get on with it in the rows. It doesn't really compete with the trees now. They're bigger than they are in this picture. They die down every year, so they give quite a nice sort of mulch effect. They're great for wildlife. The goldfinches just adore them. They look a bit unsightly, so if you're the type of farmer that doesn't want your neighbouring farmer to think you've got a farm full of weeds, then they're certainly an issue. But for us in our situation, they're not a massive challenge at the moment. And at some point we'll be taking the fences down when the peri pairs are big and letting the stock going through anyway. So for us it feels like a temporary problem that we just need to live with, rather than something that we're stressing too much about. And this, so this is a bit more what they look like now. You can see that kind of mass of weed, and you can see that that brown cow is sort of reaching under a bit, but she's only getting up to about there, and really we want it to be getting up to about there. So that's why in future ones we're going to bring it closer. And then I just like touch briefly on pruning, just as it is one of those bits of management that I reckon probably gets neglected more than anything, because it never seems to be a priority, and certainly we've neglected it, I would say. We've aimed for a low input system, and low input is also includes some of the pruning, but you really don't want to be doing this on your agroforestry system. You don't want to be moving ladders about and climbing up and having to deal with stuff. Most commercial orchards now are doing something more like that, which again is probably financially not viable for most agroforestry systems, even if you had enough of one tree to make it sensible. So what we've tended to do is a bit of formative pruning when the trees go in, so years 1, 2, 3, and then to some extent we're sort of letting them fight for themselves. What that will probably mean is that we will get a lot of, particularly on the fruit trees, we'll get a lot of biennial cropping, where they have 1 year on, 1 year off, which for us is not a huge issue. It could be a problem if you need to supply, say, your box scheme. If you're growing for a box scheme and they need it every year, and suddenly you haven't got any 1 year, that's a challenge. And a lot of pruning is about evening out the yield. The trees don't prune themselves in nature. They should be able to mostly grow and be fine if they're vigorous and healthy. So it's more about managing size or managing your harvest. So we're sort of taking the view for most of our stuff that we're just going to let them get on with it. The exception will be where we're growing for timber, and I'm sure Peter's going to cover more of this, but if you want a nice, it's a terrible photo, but if you want a nice straight trunk, then you do need to keep the sides clean up to a certain height. But again, that shouldn't be a massive job, but I think it's probably one that a lot of farmers are not used to doing, and might end up forgetting until it's too late, and then if they get too big, then you've lowered the value of your timber. That's me done. Slightly over time. Sorry, Harriet.
All good. And also, I forgot at the beginning to, having warned you about it and everything, what's your favourite tree, Ben, and why?
Well, I'm going to choose. I'm going to choose a mulberry tree, and I'm going to choose a particular mulberry tree. So I used to work at a hotel called Gravetime Manor down in Sussex, which is a unbelievably beautiful garden, designed by William Robinson, who's sort of, along with Gertrude Jekyll, was one of the people that sort of repopularized wild gardens and natural planting. And I ran the walled garden there. It's an oval walled garden, stone walled garden on a south-facing slope, and it's just stunning. If any of you are ever sort of in East Grinstead, there is a footpath that sort of goes past it, and you can peek in. But there was a mulberry tree on the top of the slope that was planted on the other side of the wall and then spread over the wall in a lovely kind of sweeping arch, and there was a stone bench that underneath it. And so quite often, if sort of when I'd finished my work for the day, I'd go up and sit there and just chill out in the wall garden. So there you go. That's my mulberry tree.
That seems like an excellent selection. There are a couple of questions for you, Ben. I'm going to pick on one before we move on to Peter. So George has asked if you know, or if you've experimented with, or if you know anyone else who's experimented with establishing kind of or experimenting with different nitrogen fixing cover crops before planting. So you gave a slide right at the beginning that and talked about the possibility of kind of establishing less competitive grasses or anything like that. But have you experimented with, or do you know anyone else that's experimented with kind of establishing an understory that provides any benefit to the trees?
No, I haven't. And funnily enough, I was discussing that exactly today as well. And there's a kind of there's a tension in a way, because if I was planting something in advance of, say, an arable or vegetable crop, I'd go for a really vigorous, super mixed, diverse lay with, building nitrogen, building your soil carbon. But the trouble with that is that then that's going to compete with the tree. So you then need to effectively kill it off totally and incorporate it, which you could do, so there would be, I think it would still be a benefit if you've got time to do that. But all of this is kind of, what time you're going to incorporate it, when you're going to plant. The advantage of planting into an existing lay is you're not disturbing the soil. You haven't then got bare soil afterwards. So so yes, the short answer is I don't know. I mean, clearly improving the soil before you plant will help, but you've also got to think about how you're going to incorporate it and then manage it subsequently.
And there are a couple of other questions, but I'm going to shelve them until the Q&A session at the end. And I'm going to ask Peter if he's ready to go with his presentation and ready to step in and take over. And now I've remembered, Peter, do you want to start with your favourite tree and why?
This is the awful question, because they're all favourites, really. But I have done a lot of rock climbing in my history, and I remember belaying off an aspen tree on one of our local crags, literally climbing up, probably being a bit nervous, putting a sling around this aspen tree and tying myself to it. And aspen is one of those things that's missing a lot in this landscape because it's been browsed out. It's extremely palatable. I've planted an awful lot of aspen in the last few years, and joyfully, what comes on aspen is the puss moth caterpillar. And the puss moth caterpillar is the original hungry caterpillar. So if you've ever been read to, or read to your children or grandchildren the hungry caterpillar story, that is the caterpillar on aspen. And I wish I'd put some in my presentation. I haven't, but I've got some photographs of some that we took this year, and they are hungry caterpillars. That's exactly what they are, and that's what comes on the aspen. So there we go.
A brilliant extra piece of information there. I'm going to treasure that. All right, I'll leave you to crack on with your presentation, Peter.
Right. Well, let's try and share. And this is what. Can we see that?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
There we go. Yep.
Okay.
Yep, we're there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Super.
We're on slide number 2.
And we're now back on slide 1, hopefully. There we go. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Ben. I mean, the joy of following somebody else is, of course, they answer all the questions that you might want. And I think you've actually covered an awful lot of ground, which I was going to cover, which is fine, which is brilliant, actually. And there are one or two things actually coming from those questions, which I will try and cover. And it'll be a bit ad hoc, but we'll see where we get to. So, hello, I'm Pete Leeson. I'm a chartered surveyor by training. I've worked with the Woodland Trust for 30 years. About half that time, I spent acquiring land and woodland for conservation purposes. But the other half, I've spent advising landowners on woodland and other habitat creation. I now have a special interest in regenerative agriculture, which brings me into the agroforestry space. And I spend a lot of time with farmers and landowners talking about how we reintegrate trees and hedges into farm systems, whilst maintaining or improving farm outcomes. And celebrating this year my 30 years in conservation, I've just produced a podcast series called Treeamble, where I talk to farmers and land managers, ecologists, etc., about managing land for food, people, and nature. So do please have a look at Treeamble. There's lots of examples of farmers who've changed their mindset, and it's fantastic. So when I was thinking about this talk, one of the things that came up was I just asked one of my contractors to go back to see a site he planted for us in March this year, to do a beat-up survey. And he came back to me today and he said we've had a 70% failure rate on the site. He was really embarrassed, but I think when we came down to it, we realised that 3 months early on without rain this year has essentially killed those through drought. So I think the first point I would always bring up with people is try and plant broadleaves before Christmas if you can. It's not always possible using contractors, obviously, but plant before Christmas usually allows them to get their roots down, get into moist ground before we have these now very dry springs. It's often been said that planting trees is easy and looking after them is hard. And I always say to clients that planting is only 50% of the task. Maintenance is at least 50% of the task. So maintenance should start the day after you planted your tree, and it's a really important task. Maintenance can be as simple as watering. If you've got a big scheme, you can't go water every tree, but if you've got a small scheme or one that's close to water source, then even watering in the springs we've had is a critical thing that can be done very easily. I work in Cumbria. Most of the landscape that I work with is pastoral, in fact, all of it really. So I don't really get engaged with silver arable or fruit-based systems, but I do a lot with animals. So the Pont Bryn scheme in Wales was probably one of the really inspirational schemes I looked at a few years ago. They've done so much work in sort of reconnecting that landscape and doing lots of different, what we would now call agroforestry type approaches. So the first question for me is, what are you planning and why are you planning it? Pont Bryn has some fantastic examples of the sorts of things that you might want to do in an agroforestry system. On this slide, we've got the top left, we've got a copse that's been planted and fenced off. We've got the traditional, relatively narrow hedgerow in the foreground, and have this very wide hedgerow in the middle ground. They've used all the sorts of different mechanisms you might use in terms of shelter, tree planting to get resource of timber, and also shelter. And the nice wide hedgerow is shelter, and it's a resource that they can actually cut the trees from, and they're using that for a lot for chipping, for bedding. So when you're planning your scheme, really think about what sort of elements you want to put into it. In Cumbria, I mostly get engaged with creating wood pasture, rotational grazing, or simple shelter schemes, and that's what I spend most of my time on. The common themes of those schemes are breaking up larger fields to allow for different grazing regimes now that people are mob grazing more, introducing shade and shelter directly for small number of animals, and creating browse to improve animal welfare and well-being. Less often we deal with productive woodlands, and I will come on to productive woodlands later on a wee bit. But actually, I don't find many people wanting to create blocks of woodland at the moment in the farm systems if they're browsing, because giving up grass is perceived as being a loss to the farm. So that's very much less of my work, and we can talk about it, but it's much less of my work. But the productive woodland, common themes there are creating a future timber resource, obviously, but also utilising those woodland creation sites for shade, shelter, and wind shelter in particular. A third group that we work with are those creating trees on hen ranges. One of our local egg suppliers, when they work with farmers that sign up to their system, the farmers are required to plant 20% of the range with trees. That's agroforestry. The hens are happier, healthier, the eggs are better, and there's more biodiversity with those schemes. So that's very much part of, I would say, an agroforestry system. So when we're thinking about our schemes, I would say a really sensible thing to do is to plan to minimise management. And it seems an obvious statement, but when you're designing a scheme of any nature, you should ask the question, how am I going to manage it? Designing a scheme with management in mind is sensible to reduce cost and time, and it also improves your enjoyment of the scheme. If you're building a productive woodland into your system, and you're starting with conifers, pretty much conifers are plant and go. They're very easy to deal with. They will grow well and need very little management to get away. If you're using broadleaves, which is most of the people I work with, then there is a requirement to actually maintain those, and they're a bit harder to get away. But conifer woodland, not much browse, lots of shelter, but a native broadleaf woodland has all the benefits of browse and shelter and biodiversity and water management. So some simple stepping off points for native broadleaves. Check your ground conditions before planting. Waterlogged, compacted soils will create problems. Ben showed us ripping with a tine earlier, or turning over the top soil. Those can be really important, particularly on heavier soils. And he also pointed out some of the issues with the clay opening up, but it's really important to think about your surface and what you're planting into. Conversely, free draining soils may benefit from increased organic matter. And if you're digging holes for the trees, perhaps think about putting some compost in with the tree on light soils. That'll help to build that organic matter. It'll help to reduce the loss of moisture and benefit the roots. Buy good plant stock. I usually use a small tree, a 60-40 tree. I mostly get bare root. Please get them from a reputable nursery. Don't get them at a B&Q sale. Get them in the right place. Buy local or regional provenance. So things that are grown locally. Up here, we get all of our stuff from southern Scotland. That kind of climate area, it's very similar to us here. This will reduce climate stress, and it reduces disease stress as well. I would say plant your tree properly. If you can dig a hole rather than slot plant, then do so, because this allows the tree roots to get established better. It gets them below the grass root and reduces competition. And plant trees as soon as possible after you get them from the nursery, so they don't dry out. And if the tree is going to be near or within stock browsing range, then make sure it's secure. And that means the tubes that we looked at that Ben had earlier. The standard approach to tree planting is a tube, and this is the next slide. I've got some spiral guards. Again, we saw by Ben's slides, spiral guards on a hedge. We use a lot of these up here because we have rabbits and hares as well, and also sheep. But tubes are pretty much essential to what we're doing. Obviously, there's a drive to reduce our plastic use, and we have used biodegradable things, but at the moment, the plastic tube seems to be holding out in terms of use. The idea of managing things, we're using a lot of flail mowers or whatever to actually manage our hedgerows, but we're now trying to reintroduce more traditional methods of managing hedges, in particular up in Cumbria again, and we're trying to teach people to go back and do old traditional management methods. This may be too much work for some people. It is a lot of effort, but we find in a pastoral system it's actually very useful to manage our hedgerows this way. The standard, as I said, the standard approach on planting trees for us is still using a tube. Now, one of the questions that came out earlier was ground preparation. Actually, this is what we're looking at here is a forest of flowers site. This is where we did a ploughing exercise and planting wildflowers. And in terms of tree take, this is the best I've ever seen in terms of tree take on a site. We've completely reduced the competition from grasses. The wildflowers bring in massive amount of biodiversity, but they also are quite tall and are maintaining a low temperature at ground level and maintaining moisture at ground level without the competition. So we're finding this is a really interesting way of creating woodland. Interesting that bottom right slide, it shows, that picture shows actually that using this method, we get a massive amount of regeneration as well. So ground preparation can be quite an interesting way of thinking about where we're going with tree planting. In the right circumstances, you can really establish great trees using some of these unique approaches. In fenced or deer fenced areas, it can be possible to reduce tube protection either to nothing at all or simple vole guards. And I would say if you're wanting to do that, then you need to balance the environmental and financial fence costs against areas of trees with tubes and stakes. There's clearly a balance between the costs of putting these things in at different scales. But it can be possible to do better planting in the right circumstances. In the commons and up here on the uplands, we've been using what we call hedgehog planting, which is where we're planting 50 or 100 hawthorn in very tight groups, almost like a hedge, establishing that over 2 or 3 years and then planting into our hawthorn oak or lime or other species. So using, in fact, if you like, nature's tree tubes, the thorns, to actually establish other trees. And for us, that's been quite an interesting establishment method. It clearly doesn't work if you've got sheep ingress or lots of deer, but if you've got the right level of grazing, it works really well. So all of these planting methods, whether you're planting bare or whether you're planting with a tube, Ben touched on earlier is spot spraying and all those other methods of maintaining the ground around the base of those tubes. Take on board what he said. Lots of people will chemically weed, but there's been quite a lot of research, and I saw some in Suffolk and Norfolk recently, that found that mowing and strimming and spraying did not always improve tree growth. It often stunted it. The mulching is a fantastic approach, or changing the ground cover, which is what we've shown in these slides. The thing about mowing is it very often reduces biodiversity benefits from the tall grasses. So there is a trade-off between biodiversity and managing the tree itself. So when we moved on to establishing trees, what are the major maintenance requirements? Clearly, tube plants, the tube needs to be removed. In Cumbria, there's some work now going on to create hubs to take tubes into, so we can start to recycle those plastic tubes rather than just landfill them. So the plastic comes off, it goes to a hub where we then recycle. But removing the tube is important. Stakes are best pulled off the tree. They can be laid down and left on site or stacked, but they can be left on site. But the best thing to do is to remove it from where the tree is so the tree doesn't grow into it. Individual wooden guards, and where we've got wood pasture schemes, we've used a lot of these individual wooden guards, and the scheme on the right here shows some of those wooden guards. They're really effective to create individual trees in a pasture, and we've used a lot of larch built wooden tree cages. The joy of those is they will just rot down after 10 or 15 years, so that's great. So there's very little maintenance with those at all, although sometimes the cattle rub on them and push them around, so you have to look after them a wee bit. But we also use a lot of the cactus guard type guards, which are the ones on the top left here. As Ben said, they're a fantastic sort of innovation, really, very spiky. They work really well to keep stock off, but of course they're metal, so they need to be removed at some point. And taking up his point, I think we can get 3 or 4 iterations out of each one of these. and we are now thinking that there's a sort of secondary market in using cactus guards and selling them on. Certainly they need to be resolved at some point and moved on. In terms of the maintenance of these sites, obviously a lot of what we're doing with a lot of our sites, we've got rough grassland, we're in the uplands, we've got very exposed areas. We're using animals at some point in most of our systems to maintain them. This is one which was standard planting. It was aimed as a productive woodland. Unfortunately, ash dieback came in and had a lot of ash loss. So Rob, the owner, decided that actually he was going to turn it into a wood pasture scheme. And his cattle actually absolutely love being in there. Plenty of browse for them, plenty of shelter. And he's using those animals now to manage his woodlands. And so it's a bit of a spin on the woodland creation side, but it's definitely something that he's benefiting from and his animals are benefiting from. I think you can introduce sheep into young woodlands relatively early, but with the caveat that you need to have an awful lot of observation of what's going on. If you leave the tubes on long enough until the trees push them away, that gives you bark protection. But there is this balancing point between bringing animals back into woodland too early if you're not careful. They can bark trees, they can destroy the trees that you've planted. So there's just this wee bit of balance to be thought about. And we know that animals love being in woods. This is one of my favourite slides, actually. So cattle in woods is a very natural thing, and we are using more and more, or we're working with people who are using cattle more and more often to manage secondary woodland. We're not so keen on ancient woodland, but certainly secondary woodland can be very well maintained through cattle raising. One thing that Rob touched on is the, Ben, I keep calling Rob, Ben touched on, is maintaining and managing more productive woodland. We obviously, what we're talking about really is where we've got woodlands of 1,600 stems per hectare or above. So in standard grant schemes, it's 1,600 stems. Those are tight woodlands, often planted with tubes, but sometimes fenced and bare planted. The major operations there really are potentially pruning to make sure your stems are tall and straight, and at some point thinning as well. So with a conifer block, we'd expect you to be thinning it perhaps year 15. With conifer blocks, or indeed any kind of productive woodland, I would urge you to really plan where you're siting that woodland. We have many examples planted 30, 40 years ago on farms in Cumbria where the woodland was not put in the right place. It's usually the back of the farm on poor ground, and it's inaccessible. And I've now got farmers who are having to pay to get their conifer removed, which is really unfortunate. It was there as a crop, but actually it can be a real problem. So really thinking about siting your new blocks, if you're planting woodland properly, they need to be accessible, they need to be manageable, and at some point, probably you're going to clear fell them and remove them. So that needs to be done in a very cost-effective way. So the size of that block is also important when you're planning it. How you manage it is important because you need to be able to get good cropping material out of it. That requires a thinning program, a maintenance and possibly a pruning program as well. That's quite a lot of steps, and it's going to take quite a lot of years to get there, but it's also worth planning early on. I think that's really what I want to say. I'm quite keen to get to questions because this could be we could go on and on and on about this, but I think we need to get to questions and find out what people want to find out.
All right, well, we will do that then. Can I use my position as chair, Peter, and ask you the first one? That floristic, the wildflower mixed field, that's really interesting. Yeah. Could you break down in a little more detail for me the kind of step-by-step process that you went through, kind of, and when in the calendar year you did particular activities?
It's called Forest to Flowers. It's an approach that Landlife created in Liverpool, and their work came out of the post-war demolition of back-to-backs in Liverpool. There's an awful lot of bricks and demolished land lying around, and what they did was they ground up the bricks and put wildflower seeds across it. And what it did, you had these fantastic wildflower managers in urban situations. They then took that thinking into a rural space. And what it was all about was really about reducing the fertility of the surface of the soil. So what they did was they bought a big deep plough, a metre deep plough from Denmark, a Bovland plough, and started to muck around with soils, and soil inversion followed from that. And what we've been doing with the forest plough sites is inverting the soil to a metre deep, burying all the fertility, bring up fertile soil, planting wildflower seeds across that, and then planting trees into the surface again. It sounds extremely radical. It sounds very intensive, but in terms of tree growth, it's off the scale. In terms of biodiversity, one of our sites in Yorkshire, planted in 2015, is now the richest butterfly site in Yorkshire, and it was an arable field. So that the introduction of the wildflowers, the reduction of fertility at the soil surface level is what makes this thing work. And the trees, once they find that fertility, just rocket. Lowther Park, we're doing one of those. We've done one of those. It's 5 years old. They're allowing the flowers to run through the summer, and then they're turning the cattle into that in the winter. And the cattle absolutely love it. It's full of forage. They literally dance into this thing because they love it so much. And they're now spreading those seeds out into the wider park. So it's an incredible process. It's very intensive.
Quick tweak on that question, and then I promise I'll let other people have questions. Are you doing it all in 1 year, or are you kind of allowing the wildflowers to establish for a certain period before you then put the trees in?
No, plough, put a tilth on it, wildflower seeds, plant. So it's all, you can squeeze it all into one season. And we've done about 30 of these around the country. They are incredibly impressive sites to see in terms of biodiversity. It's not for the faint-hearted, and they don't work on clay soils.
I think that knocks out most of Devon. Let's jump to the first question. So Ian asked a question about thoughts on planting through plastic strip into cultivated soil. I don't know if Ben, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can do. I mean, I have done that in the past, and it has some issues for me. So first of all, there's two options whether you plant through solid plastic or woven plastic. So if you do it through solid plastic, it tends after a couple of years to start falling apart, and you end up with bits of plastic flying around your site. And when you sort of try and mow the bit next to it, it shreds it. The sort of woven Mypex ones last much longer, but the trouble with them is you then get perennial weeds sort of either coming up through it or rooting in through the top, and it's almost impossible to get rid of it once you've got it. So you end up with this sort of massive plastic under it. So I mean it can work, I think, if you're really meticulous about keeping it weed free and about sort of taking it up after say 3 or 4 years, but I personally don't like it. I would rather put an organic or a wood chip mulch or something on.
We've had that experience at Riverford, and we think we probably have to grub out the trees in order now to get rid of the Mypex. The second question is also from Ian, which is about the availability of the kind of appropriate weeding equipment in the UK, particularly for kind of vines and kind of, I guess, more of the sort of tree crops. So he says in France they use weeding equipment for vines, and is this kind of thing available to buy in the UK? And yeah, any experience with that?
Well, I've just stuck a little video in the chat as well. I don't know if that particular one is available, but you can get some of this stuff for sure. Quite a lot of orchards will be using some of it already. I don't know whether all of the different options that are available are there or not, but yeah, you can certainly get hold of some of that specialist stuff. You can import it as well from France or Italy if you need to, but it's not cheap is the thing, and what makes sense on a vineyard with 10,000 vines, it doesn't necessarily make sense on a few rows of trees in an agroforestry setting. So we did look at buying not that particular model, but at that kind of thing, and it was going to be at the time £16,000 or something, and we thought, well, you know, we can buy a lot of mulch and pay someone to go up and down with it, you know, putting out some big weeds for that money. So we decided not to go for it. But I guess it does depend on what crops you've got and what scale, you know, how many you've got. But yeah, I would say for most smaller systems, it just wouldn't be worth the investment of money. But
I think this is an interesting kind of where agroforestry and kind of full-on top fruit mass production kind of meet. There is a show, I believe, in June or July in Kent that sort of specialises in the more sort of professional orchard machinery demos and displays of what's available. I think you get a lot of international equipment there for people to go and look at and talk to people and touch and prod and poke. Is that?
yeah, and I think I do think there's real opportunities for contractors and for, you know, particularly if you're growing in an area with a lot of fruit growing, for instance, or, you know, if there's groups of you, you know, it's worth thinking about some of this stuff collaboratively, because what might not make sense buying it on your own potentially can. But you know, the trouble with weeding machinery, I mean, less so with tree rows probably than veg, is that everybody needs it at the same time. You know, you get your sort of couple of weeks when the weather conditions are right, and you know, and then suddenly everyone's clamoring for the same bit of kit. So that can be an issue. But yeah, I mean, and my guess is potentially some of this stuff might become roboticized and therefore, you know, smaller and more achievable potentially. So, you know, I'm sure there'll be developments on a lot of this stuff.
There's another question which I think is probably for you as well, Ben, but Pete, do jump in. Is from Megan, which is, in arable systems, how are you preventing tree crop competition if the distance between the tree and the crop is 1 metre?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good point. I think I would go wider in an arable situation, almost certainly. And the other bit, there's the competition bit, which, you know, will depend a little bit on the tree. So if you've got a semi-vigorous fruit tree, for instance, it's not going to be competing so much with the crop as you know, a timber tree or something would do. The other bit you got to think about is harvest times and sort of staggering that. So, you know, Stephen Briggs, for instance, I know deliberately chose a later fruiting apple variety because he wanted all of his arable crops to be finished, and then he could drive on the soil that, you know, whereas if you haven't got that, so in that photo I showed of Fred's place, you know, he's got an alley that's wide enough that he can drive up the grass strip to harvest because he doesn't want to be driving on his vegetable beds. So there's a few considerations really when you're trying to work out the width of the tree alley and what you're going to do and how you might need to grow on it. So yeah, there's a few options, but yeah, I would say in most arable situations, I think 1 metre would probably be too narrow.
Two things there. Thoughts on root pruning that might help mitigate that?
Yeah, so you did definitely root pruning, I think, is useful if you're doing minimal cultivation in the crops, or you've got very, you know, more vigorous trees, then running up with a root pruner, so that might be a subsoiler or specific root pruning machine, can help just push the roots down into the lower bits of the soil so they compete less with the crops. But yeah.
And then there was an invitation earlier for Fred to kind of chip in and talk about the thoughts of managing his understory. Fred, I don't know if you're still with us. I don't know if you're feeling bold and like being picked on, if you wanted to share a few words. But if you're up for it.
Yeah, that's okay. You should hear me now.
We can hear you. Yeah.
I can't switch on the video, sorry, or I lose my internet. But the electric fencing has been really successful for sales with sheep. And I had started with 4 rows of electric fence wire on either side, fairly close at an angle, and have that down now on some rows down to 2 rows, and I have got it that I've lost no grass in between, so the sheep are able to eat in from both sides, so there's no loss of grassland. I'm using about 60 centimetre plastic guards, so very little plastic. And really, there was no actual detail as to how to do it, and it was more just experimenting on farm here, trying to see how I could do it. And it's basically just to adjust the height and the standoff of the electric fence wire to suit the livestock that is on the farm. So where Ben was chatting about showing the cattle there with the electric fence, really by just moving maybe one or two of those posts in on that line, he would get an idea as to how close he could go without actually damaging the trees. And that would give an idea as to where to go for future things. There was a local guy here had read about it in the paper, and he had come and he'd looked at it here. And the Woodland Trust here in Northern Ireland, they planted a 500 tree system for him in his sheep and poultry unit, and he is 1,500 metres now of this done, and is really pleased with it. It seems there's an awful lot of benefits to it. The reduction in plastic, reduction in materials. You've no posts next or near the trees, the tree roots. There's nothing to rub off. So I'll try maybe and get a few photographs, maybe in the next day or two, a few recent photographs, and I'll post them to you. Maybe you can send them just if somebody wants them, that will be there, that will see them.
That would be awesome. Thank you very much, Fred. We'll put it on the website when we put them up. I'm going to repeat some of the questions that have already been asked and answered in the chat, just because I don't always read the chat when I'm on other people's webinars. So I'm going to assume that not everyone's read this one. So I asked you a question, which I don't know, both of you could answer. We put some hazelnuts in this year, and we've lost quite a few of them, and it's a stressful year, but I formative pruned them in year one to a single stem, because we want to kind of shake and catch them. So I didn't want like a multi-stem hazel. Did that put too much stress on the tree in year one? Like if I'd not pruned them, would they have been better off kind of facing deer and drought without that additional pruning stress? Or actually, do you think sort of pruning in year one is quite important, particularly depending on what the kind of future intention and management purpose of the tree is? I don't know. Pete, do you have any thoughts on when to start pruning?
Well, some thoughts, whether they're right or not, I don't know. But I mean, hazel can be quite water demanding when it sets off. So the seasons we've been having are really stressful for plants. If you're adding the stress of pruning on top of that, then you probably are stressing the plant. My experience is very northern as opposed to where you are, and I would say that I would leave the plant at least a year before you start to do anything with it. Having said that, we've got hedge planting contractors here that plant all the hawthorn and then go and halve the size with a pair of secateurs because they reckon it improves growth. So I think there's so many variables with seasonality, with your soils. If the soil is waterlogged, that's going to hold them back. I mean, there's all sorts of stress points within plants. If you're then adding pruning onto that as well, maybe it's not the right thing to do early on. And also in terms of time saving, it might be a good idea to see if the plant survived a season before you prune it. You know, just why go in immediately? Why not wait a year, make sure it's growing, and then prune it?
Ben, did you want to jump in with any thoughts?
Well, yeah, all of that sounds very, very sensible. The only time I think I regretted it, we had some very tall plums and gauges that arrived, and they were 5 or 6 feet on a single one. They'd grown really well, and I staked them, and I had a sort of halfway up stake, and I thought they'll be fine, you know, they're good and vigorous, and actually they all ended up being blown and leaning. And then I didn't prune them in time, and I've now sort of got this job of trying to get them back to sort of somewhere straight, and I've ended up having to sort of take new leaders off them and train them in. So in that situation, I think if I'd reduced it by, you know, a third or something, I think I'd have ended up with a much sturdier stem. But I think Peter's probably right. In most cases, you're better off leaving it probably for a year. But
in that circumstance, I'd probably say to start with smaller plants.
Yes, fair point.
You know, we spend a lot of money on big trees that have spent a lot of time in the nursery. They need their investment back, so they charge you a lot of money for it. Start with a smaller plant, and then it's in your gift to look after it.
Yeah. Although with some of the fruit, it's quite hard to choose what you get at the moment.
Yeah, of course.
I am going to mention one thing that relates to this, actually, because you both use cactus guards as well. And my one sort of finding with the cactus guards is if you don't prune or tie in the trees, if you're in a windy area, you can get a lot of issues with the bark, kind of with basically the trees ring barking themselves on the cactus guard if they're rubbing too much. But with the cactus guards in particular, because they're quite narrow, I've been trying to kind of take off side branches of trees, because that tends to cause they tend to start rubbing really quickly on the metal of the cactus guards. So I've been trying to encourage the trees to get out of the cactus guards as quickly as possible.
So
I don't know if you've had that experience.
Yeah. So Tim Nicholson and I have a very gentlemanly sparring match on cactus. I love them to bits, but we use them. A lot of them are double that I use. So turn it through 90 degrees. It's 1 meter high. It's slightly wider. Put one on top of the other. We have red deer up here. They will munch anything that's under 2 meters. So that gives you the 2 meter protection. It gives you a bit more space. We always put 3 trees, if not 4 trees in a guard. So you put an oak in a 1.2 meter tube, and then hawthorn and crabapple and dog rose, anything else you can cram in. There's no reason why those are too close. They're not too close. They will work together underneath the ground really nicely. So companion planting is brilliant. They come up together. That holds things nicely in place, and the 1.2 tube pushes the tree up, the main tree up. So that's how we're doing it. But and every single guard approach has its downsides. None of them are perfect. And this year, because of the drought, we've seen tubes which would normally be perfectly okay. They've just frazzled off the trees because they've been so dry and so hot. They've just been frazzled off. So there's no perfect solution.
Anything to add, Ben, or happy to leave it at that?
Well, the only thing we had one, not so much with cactus guards, but where we'd use the green mesh deer guards, which I generally quite like, from a tree performance point of view. They're plastic, but so I had them with the Perry pears, and then they sort of got up, and then they started sort of sending out these side branches, and the disadvantage with the mesh is that they grow out through the mesh. And so I thought, well, I really need to sort this out. I want to prune a bit of that stem. And I thought, well, they're big enough now to have got away from the hares. So, and the leader was high enough to get away from the deer. So I'll cut half of the mesh off effectively. So leave the base still guarded, but free up the top. And I thought I was being sort of quite clever and sort of trying to, solve it this way. But what I hadn't figured was, because of the mesh, that main stem was still really weak, and so I cut half it off, and the stem wasn't strong enough to cope, and I lost a load that just snapped. And they were that sort of thickness. They weren't really thin, but they obviously were too supported by the guard still. And when I took half that guard away, they weakened and snapped at the sort of point where I'd cut the guard down. So luckily I only did kind of 6 or 8 of them. So once you sort of got it on, it's better to leave it until it's really strong and not going to do it, rather than sort of mess about with it.
Pete, unless you have anything to come back on that one, I've got a question for you, which is that someone's asking a question about why you usually go for bare-rooted trees and why not cell-grown trees. And they found that cell-growing works really well for them for hedgerows, and they find it plants easier. It's easier to store, to move around, to water. Any thoughts on that preference?
I actually have nothing against cell-grown stuff, except that in the seasons we're having, the cell is relatively short, and so if you're putting that into a grass sward, you are putting that cell into exactly the same space as where the grass roots are. So where they're fighting for moisture, if you're not careful, then it's in exactly the same space. So my preference is to have, the best people to plant trees are school kids. So our 7, 9, 10-year-olds that we use on volunteer stuff plant really good trees, because they dig a hole, they get the soil out, they muzzy it up, they put the tree roots down, they put the soil back in, they turn the turf upside down and pop it on top. They grow fantastic trees. And that, if you have the opportunity to do that, that is the best thing. So nothing against cells, but we've had probably as many losses with cells as we have with bare root, if not more, and they're more expensive. And they're also heavier. So I've done schemes of 200,000 plants. And if you've got contractors out there planting 200,000 trees, they don't want to know cells, because they're too heavy, they're too bulky. There's a lot of movement on sites. Some of our sites are 500 meters above sea level, so they're awkward things to get to. So bare root every time for me, but that's not to say cells don't have their advantages.
And you want the cells to go in moist, don't you? But you don't want to plant with a dry root ball. So, that makes them sort of even heavier. But I mean, we do plant some cells as well. And as you say, for smaller numbers, I think it's great. But yeah, for big numbers, I wouldn't use them. And
early in the season, you can get, I like to see my broadies in before Christmas. That's not possible because we have contracts that last longer than that. But if you can get them in before Christmas, that's great. If you get those cells, you can put them in on October. That's brilliant because they've got a chance to establish before we have these awful, droughty, dry, climate change-ridden springs that we've been having. Or occasionally we'd use cells in May up here in the tops, but that's really pushing it.
Would bring other trees forward to October, like Ben? Would you bring any of your fruit trees forward to something like October or November?
Well, the trouble is you can't get hold of them now. If you're planting bare root, they're often not lifting until, I don't know, December. One of my suppliers didn't lift anything through until. So yeah, I mean, I agree with Peter entirely. If you can get them in December, that's great. But often they weren't delivering them until January. So you're then going, well, are you going to plant pot grown for fruit, which in my experience haven't established as well. I prefer bare root trees generally, certainly for fruit trees where you can get them. With the apricot trees, when we planted them, one variety was only available bare root and one was only available in pot, and we lost quite a few, and all of the ones we lost were the pot grown ones. None of the bare root ones died. But sometimes it depends what you can get and when you can get it. And I think particularly for some of the fruit and nut stuff, which is certainly at the moment pretty hard to get hold of what you want, and you need to order it well in advance and all of that stuff. You're a little bit beholden to sort of when it arrives and how it arrives.
Yeah, experience I know only too well. On the question of kind of getting them through this droughty summer, so I know you've answered it in the chat already, Ben, but so I'm starting to wonder if you're interested in agroforestry, is the first thing that you should plant a donor site for wood chip? So kind of really high density willow or alder that you're going to coppice ruthlessly for the whole of its life, and it is just going to be there to provide chip for all of the other trees that you want to plant afterwards. What thoughts?
Well, I mean, obviously, I would always say plant something for wood chip, but equally, I guess, so I think I said in the chat, it really depends on what your objectives are for the agroforestry. What are your prime motives? Because at the moment, in most parts of the country, you can still get hold of wood chip. I know it's getting harder and more expensive in some parts, but what I wouldn't want is people to go, I'm gonna sort of not plant the main things that I really want to for whatever my objectives were, because I need to wait for the wood chip to grow. So if you could do it simultaneously, then yeah, absolutely, planting something that will provide that alongside and enhance your ability to plant trees, further down the line, then yeah, absolutely, it makes sense.
There was a question, or it wasn't a kind of question, it was more of an observation from Megan about interplanting in tree rows. Megan, now that I know that you're on the call and I know that you are an aficionado of all things agroforestry, I wonder if you'd be happy to jump on for a couple of minutes and kind of give us some of your thoughts from the session, or things that it prompted you to think of, or kind of extra things you'd kind of want to throw in.
Hi, Harriet and Ben, it's good to see you. I love these presentations that the Soil Association and the Woodland Forum give. They're so informative. I wish we would do more of these here in the States. So thanks. I'm always so psyched when you're running these. I just learned a whole bunch of stuff actually in this presentation, so that was great. But yeah, at the moment I'm writing a little bit of a technical manual on alley cropping, and farms are always asking us how to prevent tree crop competition. And actually, when I spend some time, there's a lot of different ways to do it, which I think got mentioned here. That has its challenges. But one kind of exciting way was that I saw in France was interplanting, where, and most people are doing this and arid locations where you want they're interplanting, let's say they have peaches and they're interplanting shrubs in between those peaches. Well, the shrubs are actually forcing those tree roots further down in the soil strata to seek water and resources that aren't competing with the shrubs. And I thought, well, wow, this is, I thought this was anecdotal information. I was like, well, that sounds groovy. But then I did all of this research, and there's a lot of research that suggests it's a really wonderful way to mitigate some of that root competition within the arable crops. And then the other one was planting, a meter away from the trees with a shrub that has a fibrous root structure that can in some way intersect the tree roots from entering the actual growing space. I don't know if that's what you wanted me to share, but that was just one observation, because I'm always interested in hearing from horticulturists like Ben about their experience, planting trees alongside crops and how you manage that.
No, I'll take any observations you have, Megan. Yes, Ben, go for it.
Sorry, can I? Because it's really interesting. So if you're planting them, so those are your two trees. If you're planting your shrub in between them, obviously it will force the roots down where it is, but does it also then force them down and stop them growing out sideways?
Well, that supposedly, and what French researchers have demonstrated is that, and it's not a great thing, but it creates columnar roots on the trees, which isn't necessarily a great thing if you're in windy areas. They develop more primary root systems rather than secondary and feeder roots. But it's basically forcing those roots below the shrub so that they can reach water further down and resources further down. Yeah, so there's lots of different ways to manage, that becomes a management issue with, mulching and and how you get it planted, and it's all a trade-off. But that one's always been like on my mind. How are we managing root competition?
We seem to be at an end for any extra questions, but we've got 5 minutes after the session. While people think for a moment on if they have any extra questions, or if I've missed a question, let me know. I'm going to sort of add in a couple of my own thoughts based on what you guys have said, which are just a couple of things that I've picked up from other people. So in terms of where you're dealing with the silver horticultural system, so Andy Dibben at Abbey Home Farm, he's sort of got his trees in a silver horticultural system, and he is a big fan of creating a stale seed bed ahead of planting the trees. And ahead of putting in your wildflower mix. So he did a wildflower mix on a much sort of smaller and strip basis, like in comparison to what you were talking about, Peter, but he found it was really important to establish the stale seedbed first, or it gets overtaken by perennial reeds really quickly, which I think is quite a sort of valuable piece of information. And then again, on a sort of picking that information up, one of the farms that we planted some walnut trees with last year, they cultivated the row that they were going to plant the walnut trees into with the interest of establishing a kind of clover mix in that row. The big downside of that was it made the soil a lot looser and a lot wobblier when we put the fence posts in to support the cactus cards, because it had all been thoroughly cultivated, so the stakes all had a bit of a wobble on them. So sort of, as we say, like swings and roundabouts and compromises of every system. But any final thoughts, Ben and Pete, if you want to kind of give us a wrap up of your thoughts this evening, because I don't see any more questions popping up.
Well, I was just going to, Andy and I did a webinar last week for the OGA on horticultural systems. So if people are interested in hearing Andy, who is really amazing and really inspirational chat, then I think it's now up on the Organic Growers Alliance website. So.
And for me, I think the joy of my last 15 years has been to get into regen agriculture. But actually, it's some really quite interesting radical people who have started to do some interesting things, like the Forest of Flower sites. And it's been joyful that there's people experimenting all the time. I love that. And people who are really trying to understand what plants are doing collectively and what value they're adding in terms of animal welfare, nutrient density of food, browse in animals, medication animals. I think that has just become really an amazing space. And for me, the observation I would say is we modify our landscapes and we make them simple. And that is not what nature does. And the more we can move to complicated landscapes, untidy landscapes, and kind of give up on some of the tropes of management for tidiness sake, I think we would all do better out of it and probably have more fun and less work.
Peter, I've actually thought something else for you, but that was which is unfortunate because that was a really good summary. But I noticed in your picture that you said was a favourite picture that the cow was wearing a no fence collar, and I wonder if you have a few thoughts on the use of the no fence system in wood pasture grazing.
Lots and lots of thoughts.
Well, you've got like 2 minutes.
That site was Kingsdale Head in Yorkshire. I helped the couple that bought it. They're rewilders. They bought a farm. The sheep have gone. They brought back Rigate Galloway cattle. They've got collars on. They've done 250 hectares of peat restoration. We were told by Natural England very firmly that the cattle would trash the peat. We said no, they won't, because they won't want to be there. So the collars have been really helpful, not to guide where the cattle go, but to tell us where they want to go. The cattle have studiously avoided the peat bog because it's too wet and there's nothing for them to forage on there, and they've gone everywhere else. So that's mapped the hot spots of where the cattle want to be. It's a very natural system. They go where they want to go, and they're telling us what they want to eat and when they want to eat it. And they go to some parts of the site in some parts of the year, other parts of the site in other parts of the year. It's the data we get back that tells us what the animal wants, that then gives us the information to allow us to then think about how we manage and design the next scheme. So really useful bits of kit. Well, but you do have to have a signal.
Yeah. Well, if anybody else is interested in no fence collars, Nikki Yoxall, who's part of Pasture for Life, she did a presentation at Groundswell, and because she uses the no fence collars to move cows through grazing woodland, and that presentation from this year's Groundswell is also now available online. It's the last minute spurt of the questions. We haven't run out after all. There's a final one coming from you, Ben, about interested to hear what you said about snapping of tree guards, free growing trees of thicker trunks and roots. What is the impact of a tall tree guard on stem thickness and stability? Although you both might have thoughts on that, so maybe we consider that our last question.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sure Pete knows more than I do probably, but certainly, if you support a stem, it doesn't grow thickness. It doesn't, it's not able to support itself. So in an ideal world, you would plant, a seed and let it grow without any support or guarding, and it would cope and blow in the wind and strengthen itself. But because we have to protect, in a lot of situations, we have to protect against pests, then you end up, I think you inevitably end up weakening the tree. And you mentioned in the cactus guard, the advantage of not staking within the cactus guard is you get it, it will move a little bit, so it's getting some of that strengthening, and that helps it as well to grow roots and things. But you then get the rubbing. So all of this is a balance. Is like Peter said, there's no perfect solution. All of it's a balance. You have to guard it a bit, but you don't want to guard it too much. And if you're staking it, I try and stake it as low as possible to allow some of that wind blow. But then, as I said, with those plum trees, I'd stake them too low and they were too tall and they ended up bending over. So it's I think it's trying to understand the effect that being supported will have. And if you nurture something too much, it can't build resilience, in anything. So it's I guess, but yeah.
Totally and utterly agree. We have often now on our upland sites, because they are so exposed in awful ground, we often now go up there and just prune the tops out, or take the wind sail off, particularly birch. Birch is a classic for falling over. Alder often gets up too high too quickly, so we just bring in the wind sail by pruning, leave the leader, but take the wind sail off it. That makes a major difference in our upland sites, and stops that thing. It stops it falling over. But yeah, it's not like a kid. If you over support it, it won't grow up.
That explains so much about my life. Well, thank you both so much for your amazing expertise and knowledge that you've brought to the session. It's been really interesting to listen to both of you, and really appreciate the time that you've given for us this evening. And I'm sure everybody that sort of watches it back online will appreciate also. So thank you very much. This was the penultimate episode in our kind of webinar plan and deliver your own agroforestry farm will inform webinar series. The final one is going to be on August the 15th, and the topic is harvesting, processing and marketing your agroforestry crops. And so again, we'll try and cover that both from a kind of tree crop sort of fruit nut sort of perspective, and then also from a forestry and timber perspective if we can, although details are a bit TBC. And then the reason well, it's not just the reason we organise this series, but the reason that the series ends in August is because the agroforestry show is in September. And Ben, would you like to give us a final plug of why people should come to the agroforestry show before we wrap up?
I'm certainly very happy to do that. So the agroforestry show, September the 6th and 7th, we're holding it at Eastbrook, so you've already seen some of the pictures of it. We've got 4 tents, loads of speakers, we've got farmers, we've got researchers, we've got policymakers, we've got some practical demos, we've got design clinics. The Farm Woodland Forum will be there with sort of loads of the people who have been doing this stuff for 30 or 40 years. So yeah, there'll be, I hope it